Marcus Chen had always been fascinated by the darkest corners of human nature. At 32 years old, he was a data analyst by day, but his true passion emerged after sunset, when he would plug in his noise-canceling headphones and dive deep into the world of true crime podcasts. His angular face, framed by thick-rimmed glasses and neat black hair, would remain expressionless as he absorbed every gruesome detail of humanity's most twisted acts. Tonight was no different. Rain pelted the windows of his downtown Seattle apartment as Marcus settled into his worn leather chair, the city lights creating a kaleidoscope of colors across his living room walls. He had discovered a new podcast called Forgotten Murders, cases that had slipped through the cracks of mainstream media, stories that most people had never heard. The host's voice was crisp and professional as she introduced tonight's episode. The Bellingham Strangler, a case that never made headlines. Marcus adjusted his headphones and took a sip of his black coffee, already drawn in by the mysterious title. Between March and July of 2019, 3 women were found dead in the greater Bellingham area, the host began. All victims showed signs of manual strangulation, and all were discovered in wooded areas exactly 17 days apart. What made this case particularly unusual was the killer's methodical approach and his apparent knowledge of forensic science. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. The details were eerily specific, more precise than most podcast descriptions. He had lived in Bellingham during that exact time frame, working remotely for a tech company while staying in a rented cabin outside the city. The memories of those months felt hazy, blurred by what his therapist had called stress-induced dissociation following his mother's death. The host continued with chilling precision. The first victim, Jessica Liu, was a 26-year-old graduate student who disappeared after leaving the campus library on March 15, 2019. Marcus's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor as a wave of recognition crashed over him. Marcus stared at the spreading pool of coffee as the podcast host's voice continued to detail Jessica Liu's final evening. Every word felt like a hammer blow to his consciousness, awakening memories he thought had been buried beneath months of grief and therapy sessions. Jessica was last seen walking toward the parking garage at approximately 9:47 p.m., the host narrated with clinical detachment. Security footage shows her getting into her silver Honda Civic, but the camera angle makes it impossible to determine if she was alone. The broken ceramic crunched under Marcus's feet as he stumbled toward his desk, frantically searching through the drawer where he kept old notebooks. His hands trembled as he flipped through pages of illegible scrawl from those dark months in Bellingham. Most entries were incoherent ramblings about his mother's death, but scattered throughout were detailed observations about strangers he had watched. Subject displays nervous habits, read one entry dated March 14, 2019. Bites lower lip when concentrating. Parks in the same spot every Tuesday and Thursday. Vulnerable. Marcus dropped the notebook as if it had burst into flames. The writing was unmistakably his, but he had no memory of making these observations or even owning such a notebook. The handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed, and the entries became increasingly disturbing. The podcast host's voice drew him back to the present. What's particularly troubling about this case is that the killer seemed to know each victim's routine intimately. Jessica's roommate told police that someone had been calling their apartment late at night, hanging up when anyone answered. The calls stopped after Jessica's disappearance. Marcus's throat constricted as fragmented images flashed through his mind. A silver car, a young woman with long black hair, the sound of his own voice asking someone to meet him. But the memories felt distant, like scenes from a movie he had watched years ago rather than lived experiences. He reached for his phone to pause the podcast, but his finger hovered over the screen. Some terrible compulsion kept him listening, even as every instinct screamed at him to stop. The second victim's name was about to be revealed. Rebecca Martinez, age 29, disappeared on April 1st while jogging through Whatcom Falls Park. the host announced with the same measured tone that was beginning to feel like a death sentence to Marcus. Unlike Jessica, Rebecca was an experienced runner who knew the trail systems intimately. Her body was discovered 17 days later in a secluded grove approximately 2 miles from her usual route. Marcus felt his legs give way as he collapsed into his chair. Rebecca Martinez. The name struck him like lightning, illuminating corners of his memory that had been deliberately shrouded in darkness. He remembered her now, the woman with the bright yellow running shoes who passed his cabin every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m. His notebook lay open on the desk, and with mounting horror, he found the entries about her. Yellow shoes, consistent timing, runs alone, trusting nature, stopped to help injured hiker, me, on March 28th, knows isolated areas of park. The entry was dated March 29th, just 3 days before Rebecca's disappearance. Marcus's analytical mind, the same one that had made him successful in data analysis, began processing the timeline with terrifying clarity. The dates aligned perfectly with his stay in Bellingham. The locations were all places he had explored during his therapeutic hiking sessions. Even the 17-day intervals made sense. It was exactly how long he had needed between episodes of what his therapist had called dissociative breaks. Rebecca's case showed similar patterns to Jessica's, the podcast continued. Someone had been watching her routine, learning her habits. Her running app showed that she had been receiving friend requests from multiple fake accounts in the weeks before her death, all featuring profile pictures of attractive men. Marcus opened his laptop with shaking hands and navigated to his old email accounts. Buried in folders he had forgotten existed, he found dozens of fake social media profiles he had apparently created. Each one used stock photos of handsome men, and the creation dates corresponded exactly with the victims' timelines. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely impossible to remember creating. But it was the third victim, the host said, her voice taking on an ominous tone, that would reveal the killer's most disturbing characteristic. Marcus closed his eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that he didn't want to hear what came next. The final victim was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and dissociative disorders, the host announced, and Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. She disappeared on April 18th after her last appointment of the day. The room seemed to spin around Marcus as suppressed memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Maria Santos wasn't just a victim. She had been his therapist, the woman who had been helping him process his mother's death, who had diagnosed his dissociative episodes, who had been so concerned about his missing time that she had recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation. His hands shook as he pulled up his old calendar on his phone. There it was, clear as day. Dr. Maria Santos, 4:00 p.m., April 18th, 2019. The appointment he had never made it to, according to his fragmented memories. The appointment that would have been her last. Maria's case was different from the others, the podcast host continued with chilling precision. Her colleagues reported that she had been increasingly concerned about a patient who was displaying signs of dangerous dissociative identity formation. She had scheduled an emergency consultation with a psychiatric specialist for the day after her disappearance. Marcus stumbled to his bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him appeared normal. Neat black hair, analytical eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, the same face he had seen every day for 32 years. But now he wondered what other faces might be hidden behind those familiar features. The notebook entries about Maria were the most detailed and disturbing yet. Knows too much. Asking dangerous questions about the missing time. Wants to bring in specialists. Cannot allow interference with the work. The work. Marcus had no memory of writing those words. No recollection of what work might refer to. But as he read further, the entries became increasingly technical, describing surveillance patterns, psychological manipulation techniques, and detailed plans for what they called therapeutic elimination. The handwriting in these later entries was different, sharper, more aggressive, written by someone who seemed to take pride in their methodical approach to murder. Someone who shared Marcus's body, but not his memories. Someone who was listening to this podcast right alongside him. The final victim was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and dissociative disorders, the host announced, and Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. She disappeared on April 18th after her last appointment of the day. The room seemed to spin around Marcus as suppressed memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Maria Santos wasn't just a victim. She had been his therapist. The woman who had been helping him process his mother's death, who Marcus could feel a presence growing stronger in his mind as the podcast continued, like a shadow gaining substance with each revealed detail. The host's voice seemed to be speaking directly to this other entity, awakening something that had been dormant since those dark months in Bellingham. The investigation stalled when the primary suspect, a local man with no prior criminal history, passed a polygraph test and had alibis for all 3 disappearances, the host reported. What investigators didn't realize was that they were dealing with someone who genuinely believed he was innocent, because in his conscious mind, he was. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair as fragmented images flashed through his consciousness like a broken film reel. He saw himself creating the fake social media profiles, but from the perspective of someone watching rather than doing. He remembered the satisfaction of successful manipulation, the thrill of the hunt, but these emotions felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, affects approximately 1% of the population, the host explained with academic precision. In rare cases, one identity can remain completely unaware of the other's actions, creating what psychologists call functional amnesia barriers. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Dr. Santos had been trying to tell him something during their sessions, something about his missing time and the strange gaps in his memory. But every time she got close to a breakthrough, he would experience what he thought were panic attacks. Now he realized they were the other identity fighting to maintain control. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Enjoying the show, Marcus? We should meet." Marcus's blood turned to ice. He had told no one about his podcast listening habits, hadn't spoken to anyone about his past in Bellingham. But someone knew exactly what he was doing at this very moment. Another message appeared. "Check your recent call history." With trembling fingers, Marcus opened his phone's call log. There, made just 20 minutes ago while he had been listening to the podcast, was an outgoing call to the Forgotten Murders podcast hotline. The call had lasted 17 minutes. He had no memory of making it, but someone using his phone had called in with information about the Bellingham Strangler case, someone who claimed to have intimate knowledge of the killer's methods and psychological profile. Someone who was sitting in this very chair, using his voice, while his conscious mind listened to true crime podcasts. Marcus's hands trembled as he accessed his voicemail, finding a saved message he had apparently left for himself earlier that evening. The voice was unmistakably his own, but the tone was different. Colder, more confident, tinged with amusement. "Hello, Marcus," his own voice said through the phone speaker. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation. You've been such a gracious host all these years, never asking questions, never interfering with my work. But listening to our story on that delightful little podcast seems to have stirred up some inconvenient memories." The podcast host's voice continued in his headphones, describing the killer's psychological profile with disturbing accuracy. The perpetrator likely suffered a severe trauma that triggered the formation of an alternate identity. This secondary personality would handle situations the primary consciousness found too threatening or morally unacceptable. Marcus's own voice from the voicemail laughed softly. "She's quite good, isn't she? Though she's missing some crucial details. Would you like to know what really happened during those missing months, Marcus? What you did while I was in control? The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Marcus realized he was essentially having a conversation with himself, or rather with someone else who shared his body. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but the evidence was overwhelming. You were so broken after Mother died, the voice continued with mock sympathy. Couldn't function, couldn't work, couldn't even remember to eat most days. So I took over. I handled the things you couldn't handle. I made the hard decisions. Marcus pulled up his bank statements from that period, finding transactions he didn't remember making. Cash withdrawals on the exact dates of each disappearance. Purchases of rope, duct tape, and cleaning supplies. Hotel registrations under fake names in cities where he had no memory of traveling. The work was important, Marcus, his recorded voice explained. Those women represented different aspects of our trauma. Jessica was the helpless student, like you felt after the diagnosis. Rebecca was the strong, independent woman Mother could never be. And Maria, the voice paused dramatically. Maria was the one who threatened to expose us. The podcast host was now describing the crime scenes in clinical detail, and Marcus realized with growing horror that the information was far too specific, too accurate. Someone had fed the podcast creators inside information about the murders. Someone who had been there. Someone who had done it. His phone buzzed with another text. The police never found the trophies. Would you like to know where you hid them? Marcus's apartment suddenly felt like a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Every familiar object now seemed potentially sinister, possibly hiding evidence of murders he couldn't remember committing. The text message burned in his vision. The police had never found trophies because he, or rather the other personality, had hidden them somewhere within his own living space. Check behind the loose baseboard in your bedroom closet, his phone chimed with another message. Third board from the left. I've been wondering when you'd finally be ready to see what we accomplished together. The podcast host's voice seemed to mock him now. The killer demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize his crimes, showing no signs of guilt or unusual behavior in his daily life. Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, and completely ordinary. Marcus stood on shaking legs and walked toward his bedroom, each step feeling like he was approaching his own execution. The closet smelled of cedar and old clothes, innocent and familiar. But when he knelt and pressed against the third baseboard from the left, it shifted under his touch. Behind the loose wood was a metal box he had never seen before, secured with a combination lock. His fingers moved without conscious thought, entering a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to his rational mind, but apparently everything to his other self. 031A, 0401. The dates of the disappearances. The lock clicked open. Inside were 3 small objects that made his stomach lurch with recognition. Jessica's student ID card, the plastic slightly warped as if it had been carried close to someone's body for months. Rebecca's distinctive yellow hair tie, still embedded with a few strands of her dark hair, and Maria's small silver pen, the one she had always used to take notes during their therapy sessions. But it was the 4th item that truly shattered Marcus's remaining sanity, a small digital recorder, still functional after all these years. His phone buzzed. Press play. Let's listen to our sessions together. The recorded voice that emerged from the device was unmistakably his own, but speaking with confidence and cold intelligence he had never possessed. It was explaining to someone, presumably the victims, exactly how he had studied their routines, how he had gained their trust, and how he planned to make their deaths meaningful. You represent broken systems, his voice explained to Maria Santos in the recording. You try to fix people like us, but you don't understand that some of us are already perfect exactly as we are. Marcus could hear Maria's voice responding, professional even in terror, trying to reach the Marcus she had known, the patient she had been trying to help. The recording continued for 17 minutes. Marcus sat in his closet floor, surrounded by the evidence of crimes he couldn't remember committing, listening to his own voice methodically explain murder to his victims. The recording revealed a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that terrified him more than the acts themselves. "The beautiful thing about our arrangement, Marcus," his recorded voice addressed him directly, as if he had known this moment would come, "is that you provided the perfect cover. A grieving son, isolated and vulnerable, seeking help for trauma. Who would suspect someone so thoroughly broken of such precise, calculated work?" The podcast in his headphones was reaching its conclusion. The Bellingham Strangler case remains officially unsolved, though psychological profilers believe the killer likely moved to another location and may have continued his activities under different methods. The case demonstrates the terrifying reality that some of society's most dangerous predators can hide in plain sight, even from themselves. Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but somehow he knew exactly who it was. "Hello, Marcus," his own voice said through the speaker when he answered. The voice was coming from somewhere else. Another phone, another location he apparently had access to, but couldn't remember. "I've been waiting for you to find our collection. Quite impressive, don't you think?" "You're not real," Marcus whispered, though the evidence surrounding him suggested otherwise. "You're just trauma. Just my mind's way of coping with—" "I'm more real than you've ever been," the voice interrupted with cold amusement. "You've been the passenger all along, Marcus. The therapy sessions, the recovery, the new life in Seattle, that was all my gift to you. A comfortable illusion while I established new hunting grounds." Marcus looked around his apartment with fresh horror. How many nights had he gone to bed thinking he was alone, only for this other personality to emerge and continue its work? How many gaps in his memory had he attributed to stress or insomnia when they were actually hunting expeditions? "The podcast was my invitation," the voice continued. "I wanted you to understand what we really are before we continue our work together. Seattle has so many lonely people, Marcus. So many broken souls who need our particular form of therapy." Through his apartment window, Marcus could see the lights of the city below, thousands of unsuspecting lives going about their evening routines. Somewhere among them, his other self was already watching, learning, planning. "Sweet dreams, Marcus," his own voice said softly before the line went dead. "Try not to fight it when you wake up. The work must continue." Marcus stared at the trophies in his lap as the podcast credits rolled in his headphones. The host thanked listeners for their attention and reminded them to stay safe out there. But Marcus knew safety was an illusion. He was the danger they needed to stay safe from. And tomorrow night, when he thought he was going to sleep, someone else would wake up and continue listening to true crime podcasts, not for entertainment but for inspiration.